A cool morning sun was rising above the small town streets when Colonel James Walker prepared himself for duty. He was a senior officer who had served the nation for decades, and he carried himself with calm pride. That morning he was dressed in simple clothes, not in full uniform, because he was on his way to a secure military base nearby. Even though he looked like an ordinary man to someone passing by, he carried his military identification and wore the quiet confidence of someone who had given his life to service. James drove his dark sedan carefully, obeying the traffic signals and limits. He was thinking about the day ahead, which included an important security briefing with his team. His mind was steady, his posture relaxed, and nothing seemed unusual. But only a few blocks away, a local police officer had already taken notice of him. Officer Daniels, a man known in the department for his strictness and sometimes overbearing style, spotted James's car. For reasons not based on actual violation, he decided to pull him over. He turned on his flashing lights, and James noticed them immediately in his rearview mirror. James slowed the car and pulled safely to the side. He was not worried because he knew he had broken no law. As he rolled down his window, he expected a standard check, maybe a quick explanation, and then he would continue on his way. But the moment Officer Daniels approached, the situation felt unusual. The officer's tone was sharp, and his eyes held suspicion rather than professional courtesy. "License and registration," the officer barked, even before offering a polite greeting. James, calm and respectful, nodded and reached for his wallet. "Of course, officer," he said, handing over his driver's license and vehicle papers. His voice was even, controlled, showing no sign of irritation. Instead of checking the documents, Daniel stared at James as if searching for something to criticize. "Where are you going in such a hurry this morning?" he asked. James, still calm, replied, "I'm on my way to duty, officer. I have an important assignment at the base." He spoke honestly, believing that a clear explanation would ease the tension. But Daniel's eyes narrowed. He did not accept the words at face value. "The base, huh?" he said with doubt in his voice. "I've heard that one before. People like you think you can say anything and get away with it." The words carried an edge, and James felt the sting of unfair judgment. Still, he chose not to react with anger. He took out his military identification card from his pocket and held it forward. "This is my ID, sir. I am Colonel James Walker, United States Army. I am expected at the base within the hour." Instead of respecting the card, Daniels's hand hovered near his holster. His suspicion grew stronger and his voice rose. "Don't move too fast," he warned. "Keep your hands where I can see them." James froze, placing both hands on the steering wheel to show cooperation. His heart rate stayed steady, but his mind was alert. He had faced dangerous moments in war zones. Yet here, on a quiet street in his own country, he was being treated like a threat. A couple of pedestrians walking nearby slowed down, sensing that something unusual was happening. One of them, a young man with a phone, began recording discreetly. James noticed but kept his focus on staying calm. Daniels, instead of checking the ID, suddenly unholstered his gun. He pointed it directly at James through the open window. "Step out of the car," he ordered, his voice harsh and commanding. James's training guided him. He did not make sudden moves. He looked straight ahead, his voice low but firm. "Officer, there is no need for this. I am not a threat to you. I am a serving officer in the United States Army. Please look at my identification card." His tone carried both respect and authority, the voice of a man who had commanded soldiers yet knew how to de-escalate tension. The bystanders gasped. The sight of a police officer pointing a weapon at a calm, older man was alarming. More phones appeared, capturing every detail. James slowly unbuckled his seatbelt with one hand raised high so the officer could see. "I am moving slowly," he said, narrating each action so there would be no misunderstanding. "I will open the door carefully." His movements were controlled, almost like a slow-motion drill. He opened the door and stepped out with both hands raised above his head. Officer Daniels kept his gun pointed, shouting, "Get on the ground." The order was unnecessary, as James was clearly cooperative. Yet Daniels' face showed not caution but hostility. James, still standing tall, said firmly, "Officer, I will not resist you, but I must tell you, you are making a very serious mistake. My credentials are valid and I'm on my way to official duty." The crowd was growing. Drivers passing by slowed down, shocked to see the scene. Some honked, others shouted for the officer to stop. James could feel the eyes of dozens of witnesses, but his focus remained on staying composed. Inside, he thought about the principles he had lived by: courage, honor, respect. He would not let anger guide his actions. Another police vehicle arrived, responding to the call for backup. Two younger officers stepped out and approached quickly. They looked confused to see their colleague aiming a gun at an older man who was clearly not resisting. James took the opportunity to speak in a clear voice, addressing them. "Officers, my name is Colonel James Walker. I serve at the nearby military base. My identification card is in the car. I request that you verify it immediately." The younger officers hesitated, glancing between James and Daniels. Daniels shouted, "Don't listen to him. He's refusing orders." But the calmness of James's manner contrasted sharply with the aggression of Daniels. One of the new officers looked at the ID card still lying on the seat inside the car. He picked it up, scanned it, and his eyes widened. "Sir, this ID, it's real. He is who he says he is." Daniels' face tightened, but his gun remained raised. "You can't trust that," he insisted. "He could have faked it." The younger officer shook his head, pointing at the card. "No, sir, this is official. Look at the hologram, the seal, the rank. He's a colonel." The tension in the air shifted. The crowd murmured louder and the cameras kept rolling. James stood motionless, his arms still raised, waiting for the moment when reason would overcome fear. In that silence, the weight of the scene became undeniable. Here was a decorated officer, someone who had defended the very freedoms the crowd enjoyed, facing a drawn weapon not in battle but on a peaceful street. The injustice was clear to everyone watching. As the younger officers moved to de-escalate, James kept his dignity intact. He did not shout, did not argue, but his calm presence was stronger than any weapon. The moment would be remembered not only for the officer's mistake, but also for the way a man of discipline and honor handled a situation that could have gone tragically wrong. The silence on the street felt heavy as Colonel James Walker stood with his hands raised high in the air. The younger officers now had the colonel's identification card in their hands, reading it carefully under the sunlight. Their expressions changed from confusion to shock. They looked at each other, realizing the seriousness of the situation. A respected senior military officer was standing in front of them, treated as if he were a criminal, while an armed policeman continued pointing a gun at him without reason. James could see the hesitation in the younger officers' faces. They wanted to act, but they were caught between loyalty to a colleague and the truth written on the ID card. James understood the dilemma. His long years in service had taught him that people sometimes froze when forced to choose between what was right and what was easy. Yet he also knew that truth always carried more weight than prejudice. He lowered his voice, calm but firm, and spoke so everyone around could hear. "Gentlemen, you have my identification in your hands. Verify it, contact the base. They will confirm my identity and duty. You can make this right." His words carried authority, not as a demand but as a request for fairness. The younger officer holding the card nodded slowly. "He's telling the truth," he said aloud, his voice carrying into the crowd. A murmur spread among the bystanders, some of whom had been recording from the start. Their whispers grew stronger, filled with anger at the injustice unfolding before their eyes. Officer Daniels, however, refused to lower his weapon. His jaw tightened and he shook his head. "Don't be fooled. People lie all the time. You can't just trust someone because he says he's in the army. Look at him. He's hiding something." His words no longer sounded confident. They sounded desperate. James remained motionless, his arms aching from being held up so long, but his presence remained steady. He had faced darker moments in foreign lands, where bullets flew and explosions shook the ground. Compared to those battles, this was just another test of patience and discipline. "Officer," he said, turning his eyes to Daniels, "you are making an error that you will regret. I have respected your position from the moment you stopped me. I showed you my documents. I explained where I am going. Yet you chose not to believe me. If you still doubt me, then confirm my words with your own department. Truth is only a phone call away." Daniels did not respond. His grip on the gun remained tight, though sweat began forming on his forehead. The crowd grew restless. People shouted from the sidewalks, "He showed you the ID. Put the gun down. He's a colonel." The voices mixed together louder and louder until the entire street echoed with outrage. At that moment, one of the younger officers took out his radio. He stepped back slightly, speaking quickly into it. Dispatch, this is Officer Lewis. We need a check on Colonel James Walker, United States Army. ID number? He read the details from the card. A long pause followed, filled with static. Every second felt like an eternity. James kept breathing steadily, his eyes never leaving Daniel's face. He knew the confirmation would come soon. When it did, the truth would shine brighter than any false suspicion. Finally, the voice on the radio replied clearly, confirmed. Colonel James Walker is active duty, stationed at Fort Hamilton Base, clearance level Alpha. He is expected for a briefing this morning. The words struck like a hammer. The younger officers looked at Daniels in disbelief. They now had undeniable proof. The colonel was exactly who he said he was. Daniel's weapon wavered, his hands trembling. Yet even in that moment, he refused to admit his mistake. "This doesn't mean anything," he muttered, though the crowd jeered loudly. James lowered his arms slowly, not in defiance but in dignity. His calm voice filled the air again. "You have heard it yourself. Now it is your duty to act with reason. I am not here to fight you. I am here to serve my country. Do not let your fear and pride cause further damage." His words carried the weight of wisdom, and even the restless crowd grew quiet to listen. The younger officers, now firm in their conviction, stepped between Daniels and the colonel. "That's enough," Officer Lewis said, holding his hand up. "Put the weapon down, Daniels. This man is not a threat. He's a decorated officer, and you've gone too far." His partner moved closer to James, almost protectively as though shielding him from further harm. Daniels hesitated, his pride clashing with reality. The cameras continued to record every second. He knew the world was watching, yet he struggled against the truth. His hand finally dropped, the gun lowering slowly toward the ground. Relief spread through the crowd, though anger still simmered. James exhaled deeply, finally lowering his own hands. His shoulders ached, but his spirit was unbroken. He looked around at the people who had gathered, their eyes wide with shock, their phones held high, capturing the moment. He understood what this meant. This was no longer just a street encounter. This was a story that would reach far beyond these city blocks. One of the bystanders shouted, "It's all on video." Everyone saw it. Another added, "We're sending this online right now." The colonel realized the truth was not only confirmed by official channels but also preserved in countless recordings. The people themselves had become witnesses, ensuring the incident could never be hidden or twisted. As the tension eased slightly, James adjusted his jacket, standing tall. He addressed the younger officers once more. "Thank you for doing your duty and confirming the facts. That is all I ask, for fairness, for respect. I will continue to my post now. But know this, the world has seen today what happens when suspicion outweighs truth." He returned to his car, his movements careful and deliberate. The crowd stepped aside respectfully, giving him space. Before getting inside, he turned once more to face Daniels, who now stood with his head lowered, his weapon holstered, but his reputation already damaged. James's voice was steady, neither cruel nor forgiving. "Officer, you had the power to treat me with respect from the beginning. Instead, you chose fear and hostility. I hope you reflect on this day, because the consequences will follow." With that, James entered his vehicle. The engine started, and he drove away slowly, leaving behind a street buzzing with noise. People clapped, some cheered, others shouted at the disgraced officer. Phones were already uploading the footage to social media platforms. Within minutes, the video would begin its journey across screens nationwide. Back inside his car, James's thoughts were quiet but firm. He had stayed true to his values even when faced with a drawn gun. He had not let anger lead him, though every part of him had burned with injustice. Instead, he had shown the strength of calmness and discipline, traits earned through years of service. As the base gates came into view, he knew his morning had changed everything. He was no longer just preparing for a routine briefing. He had just become the center of a story that would spark national debate. The moment was over, but the echoes had only begun. The truth had been revealed, not only to the officers on the scene but to the world that was about to watch. And for Colonel James Walker, the test of patience and honor had only set the stage for what was coming next. The video spread across the internet faster than anyone on that quiet street could have imagined. Within hours, clips of Colonel James Walker standing calmly with his hands raised, while an officer pointed a gun at him, appeared on social media feeds, news channels, and even international platforms. People everywhere paused to watch. The contrast was shocking. A senior military officer who had dedicated his life to protecting the country, being treated like a threat in his own hometown. The images of his composure against the officer's aggression stirred powerful emotions in viewers. At first, the video was shared by locals who had witnessed the event. "Look what happened on Main Street this morning," one post said, showing shaky footage of James speaking firmly while keeping his arms raised. Another clip showed the moment the younger officers confirmed his identity, proving beyond doubt that Daniels had ignored clear evidence. Soon, hashtags began trending, with words calling for justice, accountability, and respect for service members. News agencies quickly picked up the story. Reporters visited the area, interviewing the bystanders who had been present. One young woman who had recorded much of the scene told a local channel, "I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The man was calm, respectful, and showed his ID, but the officer didn't care. I felt like I had to record it because no one would believe it otherwise." Her video alone gained millions of views within a day. Colonel James, meanwhile, carried out his duty at the base that morning, staying focused on his work. His fellow officers, however, had already seen the video by the time he arrived. Word spread quickly within the military community and emotions ran high. Some were angry, others deeply disappointed, but most felt proud of how James had handled himself under such pressure. His calmness had protected not only his own safety, but also the dignity of the uniform he represented. The base commander called him into his office later that afternoon. The commander was a seasoned general who had known James for years. He looked at him with a mix of respect and concern. "James, I've seen the footage," the general said, his voice serious. "You showed discipline and restraint even when threatened. That speaks volumes about your character. But this will not stay quiet. It has already reached national attention. You should prepare yourself for questions, interviews, and perhaps even hearings." James nodded. He was not seeking the spotlight, but he understood that sometimes fate chose moments for people, whether they wanted them or not. "Sir, I only did what I felt was right," he replied. "I did not want anger to control me. I wanted truth to speak for itself." Outside the base, public outcry grew louder. Veterans organizations released statements of support, condemning the treatment of James and demanding accountability from the police department. Civil rights groups also joined the conversation, pointing out that the incident reflected deeper issues of bias and abuse of authority. Families of service members wrote letters, saying that if such treatment could happen to a colonel, then no one was safe from unfair suspicion. Television talk shows invited analysts, retired generals, and legal experts to discuss the case. Some replayed the video frame by frame, highlighting James's calmness as he narrated his movements to avoid misunderstandings. Others pointed out how quickly Officer Daniels had escalated without reason. A retired officer remarked, "What strikes me most is not just the danger but the dignity of Colonel Walker. He held his ground without raising his voice. That is leadership in action." On social media, people flooded the platforms with messages of support. "Respect to Colonel Walker," one post said, receiving hundreds of thousands of likes. Another wrote, "This man is the definition of calm under pressure. He deserves honor, not humiliation." Hashtags calling for justice and accountability stayed at the top of trending lists for several days. Meanwhile, protests began forming outside the local police station. At first, only a handful of people gathered, holding signs and demanding answers. But as the video continued to spread, the numbers grew. Veterans in uniform joined, standing shoulder to shoulder with ordinary citizens. They held placards that read, "Respect our soldiers," "Justice for Colonel Walker," and "No more abuse of power." The atmosphere was charged but peaceful, with chants echoing through the streets. Inside his modest home, James's phone rang constantly. Friends, family, and colleagues all reached out to check on him. His wife Margaret watched the news reports with tears in her eyes. She had stood by him through deployments, separations, and battles overseas, but she never imagined he would face such danger in their own town. "I am proud of you," she whispered one evening as they sat together. "You didn't let fear or anger win. You showed who you truly are." James held her hand gently. "I only did what I've always believed in, calmness, patience, and respect. But now the world has seen it, and I cannot ignore the responsibility that comes with it." As the days passed, pressure mounted on the police department to respond. City officials held emergency meetings. The mayor received countless calls and emails from citizens demanding justice. Even members of Congress began commenting, with one senator stating publicly, "Our servicemen and women deserve respect, not hostility." What happened to Colonel Walker is unacceptable. News vans lined the streets near the police station, reporters delivering live updates each hour. Some officers inside the department felt uneasy, knowing the incident had damaged their reputation. Others defended Daniels quietly, saying he had simply been cautious. But most agreed the situation had spiraled far beyond what anyone had expected. Through it all, James stayed silent in public. He did not seek interviews or give long speeches. Instead, he allowed the truth of the video to speak for itself. His silence only added to the respect people felt for him, as it showed he was not using the incident for personal gain. He remained the same disciplined, humble officer he had always been. At one point, a group of veterans visited him at the base. They shook his hand firmly, one after another. A retired sergeant told him, "You stood for all of us that day. You reminded people that strength doesn't always come from force. Sometimes it comes from calmness." Those words touched James deeply, reminding him that his actions had rippled far beyond his own life. By the end of the week, national networks were broadcasting the protests, the statements, and the growing demand for accountability. The story was no longer just about one man and one officer. It had become a mirror reflecting society's larger struggles with respect, equality, and justice. Children at local schools even discussed the story in classrooms. Teachers asked students what they learned from it, and many replied with words like patience, respect, and courage. Some drew pictures of James standing tall with his hands raised, a symbol of quiet strength. For James, the attention was overwhelming at times, but he bore it with the same composure he had shown on that street. He knew the storm was far from over. The investigation had only just begun, and consequences were still to come. But in his heart, he believed something good could rise from the pain, that the incident might inspire change, not just in his town but across the country. As night fell on yet another day of protests, chants filled the streets, candles were lit, and voices called out for justice. The people were united in a way rarely seen before, and at the center of it all was one man who had chosen dignity over anger, truth over fear. The public outcry had grown too powerful to ignore, and the wheels of accountability were now in motion. The investigation began almost immediately after the protest grew too loud for city officials to ignore. The mayor held a press conference announcing that the police department's internal affairs unit would review the incident. He also promised that an independent civilian board would oversee the process to ensure fairness. People listening clapped, but they also shouted, "We want justice, not excuses." The pressure was clear. This was not going to be swept under the rug. Inside the police department, a tense atmosphere hung in the air. Officers walked through the halls with uneasy looks, some whispering about the fallout. Everyone knew that Daniel's actions had not only harmed his own career, but also stained the department's image. While some sympathized with him, many admitted privately that his behavior had crossed the line. It was one thing to be cautious, another to ignore evidence and escalate without cause. Colonel James Walker stayed focused on his duty at the base, but he was soon called to give an official statement. A group of investigators, both from Internal Affairs and the Civilian Review Board, came to the base to meet him. They were respectful, treating him with the dignity he deserved, but their questions were detailed. "Colonel Walker, can you describe what happened from the moment you were pulled over?" one investigator asked, writing notes carefully. James spoke calmly, his words steady as he recalled each step. "I was stopped without explanation. I provided my license, registration, and military identification. I explained my destination and my duty at the base. Instead of verifying the documents, the officer drew his weapon and ordered me out of the car. I complied fully, narrating each movement to prevent misunderstanding. I repeated my identity and requested verification, but the officer continued to escalate until backup arrived. The investigators asked follow-up questions, checking times, distances, and the exact words spoken. James answered everything with clarity. He was not exaggerating, not adding unnecessary emotion. He simply told the truth, which was already powerful enough. The review board also requested the videos recorded by bystanders. Several citizens willingly submitted their footage. and soon the investigators had multiple angles of the entire encounter. Every detail was visible: the colonel's calmness, the officer's aggression, the moment the ID was ignored, and the confirmation that came from the dispatch call. The truth could no longer be denied. Meanwhile, news outlets reported daily on the investigation's progress. Commentators debated the implications. Some asked why Daniels had been so quick to draw his weapon. Others questioned whether training and bias within the force contributed to his decision. Retired law enforcement officials appeared on talk shows, admitting that procedures had clearly not been followed. "When someone presents valid identification," one said, "the next step is to verify it, not to escalate." This was misconduct, plain and simple. As the investigation continued, Daniels was placed on administrative leave. He stayed at home away from the station while protests outside grew larger. At first, he defended himself in private conversations, saying he had acted out of caution. But when evidence kept piling up, his defense grew weaker. Even some of his closest colleagues began distancing themselves. The civilian board discovered that Daniels had a history of complaints against him. Several citizens had reported him for aggressive behavior during stops, though none of those incidents had gained widespread attention. Those reports now became crucial pieces of evidence. The board concluded that this was not a single mistake but part of a troubling pattern. When the news of his record reached the public, outrage deepened. Protesters outside the police station held signs that read, "How many more times?" and "Patterns cannot be ignored." Local newspapers published articles describing Daniels's past complaints, and radio shows invited callers to share their thoughts. People spoke of fear, distrust, and the urgent need for reform. Colonel James was once again called to speak, this time at a community meeting organized by city officials. Hundreds of people filled the auditorium with cameras broadcasting the event live. When James stepped onto the stage, the crowd stood and clapped, some cheering loudly. He raised his hand gently, signaling for quiet. "I thank you for your support," he began, his voice clear and steady. "I am not here to attack anyone, but I am here to speak the truth. On that morning, I was treated unfairly despite showing respect, compliance, and identification. I believe in justice, not revenge. This is not just about me. It is about ensuring that no one else faces the same treatment in the future." His words were met with more applause, but also with tears from some listeners. Veterans in the audience saluted him, while families hugged one another. The atmosphere was emotional, yet filled with unity. After the meeting, reporters surrounded him asking how he felt about the investigation. James replied with his usual calm, "I trust the process. I have faith that truth will prevail. I only hope that this moment becomes a lesson, not just for one officer but for every person wearing a badge." Respect and fairness must guide their actions. Behind the scenes, city officials debated how to handle the fallout. The mayor and the police chief held long meetings, aware that the nation's eyes were watching. Some advised firing Daniels immediately to calm the public, while others insisted on waiting until the investigation concluded. The pressure was immense, and every decision carried weight. In the following days, the investigation report was finalized. It concluded that Officer Daniels had engaged in misconduct, violated procedures, and acted with unnecessary aggression. The report also noted that his history of complaints showed a repeated failure to meet professional standards. When the findings were released, the community erupted with both relief and anger. Relief that the truth had been officially recognized, and anger that it had taken such a public incident to expose the behavior. More protests followed, but this time the chants carried a stronger demand. "Fire him now." James remained composed, watching events unfold from his position at the base. He knew justice was close, but he also knew that the process had to run its course. He reminded those around him, justice must be fair and thorough even when emotions run high. Let the truth speak, and let the actions match the words. The police department, under immense pressure, scheduled a formal hearing. Daniels was required to appear, along with legal representatives, community leaders, and review board members. The hearing room was packed with officials, press, and citizens. James attended as well, sitting quietly in the front row, his presence alone commanding respect. During the hearing, evidence was presented one piece at a time: the videos, the dispatch confirmation, the testimonies, and the past complaints. Each detail painted the same picture. an officer who had abused authority and placed an innocent man in danger. Daniels tried to defend himself, claiming he had acted out of fear for his safety, but the evidence showed otherwise. His excuses crumbled under the weight of facts. As the session ended, one review board member addressed the room. This case is about more than one mistake. It is about accountability. It is about ensuring that power is not misused, and that those who protect us are themselves respectful of the laws they uphold. The room erupted with applause. James listened quietly, his expression calm but resolute. He knew the moment of decision was near. What began as a morning drive to work had turned into a defining moment, not just for him but for an entire community. The investigation had revealed the truth, and the consequences were about to follow. The hearing had ended with silence heavy in the air. Everyone inside the chamber knew that the final decision would change not only the future of Officer Daniels, but also the trust of the community in the police department. Reporters rushed outside to prepare their live updates. Protesters waited anxiously beyond the barricades, and citizens across the country followed the story closely on their screens. A few days later, the police chief called a press conference. Cameras flashed as he stepped to the podium, flanked by city officials. His face was serious, his voice clear. After careful review of the evidence, testimony, and official reports, he began, "We have concluded that Officer Daniels engaged in misconduct, violated protocol, and endangered the life of a senior military officer without justification. Effective immediately, Officer Daniels has been terminated from the police department." The announcement was followed by gasps, then applause and cheers from the crowd outside. Protesters raised their signs high, chanting in triumph. Some embraced each other while others wiped tears of relief. The sound of celebration echoed through the streets. Not because of anger, but because justice had finally been served. Colonel James Walker, who had chosen not to attend the press conference, watched the news from his base office. His fellow officers gathered with him, standing in respectful silence as the decision was read. One of his colleagues turned to him and said, "You did not just protect yourself that day, James. You reminded this whole country what calmness and dignity look like in the face of hostility." James gave a small nod, his eyes steady but thoughtful. In the following days, letters and messages poured in from across the nation. Strangers wrote to thank him for his composure. Veterans groups sent him plaques of appreciation. Schools invited him to speak to students about patience, respect, and discipline. Newspapers printed editorials praising his example, calling him a living lesson in courage without anger. Yet despite the attention, James remained humble. When asked by reporters for his reaction to the officer's firing, he replied simply, "This was never about revenge. It was about accountability. I only hope this decision sends a message that respect and fairness must guide those in authority. Every person deserves to be treated with dignity." The story continued to ripple outward. National leaders addressed it in speeches, with one senator remarking, "Colonel Walker's calmness should be studied by every young recruit in both the military and the police." His response turned a dangerous moment into a lesson for us all. Community leaders echoed similar words, encouraging dialogue between citizens and law enforcement. Meanwhile, Daniel's name faded into the background. He had once been known for his uniform, his authority, and his presence on the streets. But now he was remembered only for the mistake that cost him his job. Some sympathized with his downfall, but most agreed it was the rightful outcome. In conversations across town, people repeated the same thought. If he could treat a colonel like that, imagine how he treated others who had no way to prove themselves. The local police department, shaken by the scandal, began reforms. Officers were required to undergo new training programs focused on respect, communication, and de-escalation. Supervisors promised closer monitoring of complaints and stricter action against misconduct. Community meetings were organized, where citizens could voice concerns directly to officials. For many, these changes were a sign that the painful incident had sparked meaningful progress. At home, James found peace in small moments with his family. Margaret continued to remind him how proud she was. "You carried yourself with honor," she said one evening, her voice soft. "You showed the kind of strength the world needed to see." Their children, grown but still deeply connected to their father, told him they had never been prouder to carry his name. Despite the flood of attention, James never saw himself as a hero. In his heart, he believed he had only done what any disciplined soldier should do: stay calm, speak truth, and protect dignity. He did not celebrate the officer's firing, but he did feel relief that justice had been reached without further harm. Weeks later, James was invited to speak at a national veterans event. Thousands gathered, and when his name was announced, the crowd rose to their feet, clapping loudly. James stepped onto the stage slowly, his face calm but his heart touched by the respect shown to him. He waited for the noise to quiet, then spoke. "I did not choose that morning's events," he said. "They were forced upon me, but I chose how to respond. I chose patience over anger. I chose truth over fear. And I hope that choice can remind us all that dignity is the strongest shield a person can carry. We must demand accountability from those in authority, but we must also remember that calmness is a power in itself." His words echoed through the hall, and for a moment, silence followed before thunderous applause filled the space. Many in the audience wiped tears from their eyes, inspired not only by his story but by the simple truth in his message. Back in his town, life slowly returned to normal. The protests ended, the crowds dispersed, and the police department began rebuilding its image. But the memory of what had happened on that morning lingered. People spoke of it in coffee shops, schools, and churches, not as gossip but as a reminder of how easily power can be misused, and how important it is to hold leaders accountable. Colonel James continued his service quietly, attending his duties, mentoring younger officers, and preparing for his eventual retirement. But wherever he went, people recognized him. Strangers stopped him to shake his hand. Some saluted him in the street. Others simply said, "Thank you for staying calm." The incident became part of a larger conversation in the country, discussed in classrooms, training seminars, and community halls. It reminded people that real strength does not always come from weapons or force, but from composure, discipline, and truth. In the end, the racist officer who had once held a gun to James's chest lost not only his job but his reputation. Meanwhile, the colonel gained something he never sought but accepted with humility: the role of a symbol, a reminder that one person's calmness can inspire thousands. For James, the greatest reward was not the applause, the speeches, or the attention. It was the knowledge that his actions had prevented tragedy, that he had kept peace alive in a moment when violence was only a second away. He often thought about what might have happened had he chosen anger instead of patience. The thought made him grateful, because in choosing calmness, he had changed the outcome not only for himself but for everyone watching. The story ended not with bitterness but with a lesson that spread far and wide. Dignity matters, respect matters, and justice must always prevail. And for Colonel James Walker, life went on, not as a victim of injustice but as a quiet example of how truth, patience, and honor can overcome even the harshest moments.